Tonight, let us settle into a quieter corner of history. As the evening light softens and the day loosens its hold, I invite you to rest and listen as we open tonight's story together. I am your background historian, and I will walk with you gently through the long and winding beginnings of European colonization in North America. This is not a tale told in sharp edges or hurried dates, but one that unfolds slowly, like a map unrolled by candlelight. Imagine the hush of the ocean at dusk. Waves breathe in and out against wooden hulls. Stars appear one by one above a darkened sea. Long before borders were drawn or cities named, these waters carried unfamiliar ships toward unfamiliar shores. They came not all at once, and not for one single reason, but in waves of curiosity, ambition, fear, faith, and longing. Tonight, we will not rush to judgments or conclusions. Instead, we will linger in the moments where choices were still forming, where paths had not yet hardened into history. We will listen to the quiet creak of ships at anchor, the murmur of prayers spoken below deck, the soft scrape of boots against new soil. We will notice the silences too. The pauses between meetings. The uncertainty on both sides of first encounters. Before Europeans arrived, North America was already alive with movement and meaning. Vast networks of trade crossed forests, rivers, plains, and coasts. Communities carried stories older than memory, tied to land, seasons, and sky. Tonight's story does not begin with discovery, but with convergence. Different worlds, shaped separately over centuries, slowly drifting toward one another. As we move forward together, you will hear of settlements that struggled to survive their first winters. You will hear of promises made and broken, alliances formed and dissolved. You will feel the tension between hope and fear that lived inside those early colonial outposts, where survival depended as much on cooperation as on endurance. And always, beneath the surface, there will be the steady presence of the land itself. Forests that seemed endless. Rivers that carried both life and loss. Seasons that cared little for human plans. This story is not a straight line. It bends and loops. It contains moments of wonder alongside moments of cruelty. Tonight, we will allow space for complexity without letting it disturb our rest. History can be held gently, even when it is heavy. So take a slow breath now. Let your shoulders soften. Let the noise of the day fade into the background. We will begin at the water's edge, where Europe and North America first faced one another across the quiet space of the sea. In the stillness of this moment, let us drift softly onward into Part 1, where the earliest voyages set sail and the long night of colonization begins to take shape. In Part 1, we begin far from the continent itself, before shorelines were named or claimed, before footsteps pressed into unfamiliar sand. We begin instead with water, with distance, and with the quiet restlessness that lived in Europe at the edge of the 15th century. I imagine myself standing beside a harbor just before dawn. The air is cool and faintly salted. Ships rock gently against their moorings, their hulls dark and patient. These vessels are not grand by modern imagination. They are narrow, crowded, and uneasy companions for the ocean. Yet within them is carried something powerful. A belief that the world stretches farther than the horizon suggests. A hope that land, wealth, or meaning waits beyond the curve of the sea. Europe at this time is a place of limits. Fields are overworked. Cities are crowded. Old trade routes are strained by conflict and cost. Stories circulate through taverns and marketplaces about distant lands, about spices that transform food, about metals that glitter even in rumor. Monarchs listen closely. Merchants calculate risks. Sailors listen with half belief and half longing. Navigation itself is still uncertain. Maps are incomplete and often wrong. Coastlines blur into imagination. Compass needles wobble with mystery. And yet, there is confidence, too. Confidence born from small successes, from islands reached and returned from coastlines traced and redrawn. Each voyage adds a thin layer of certainty over deep uncertainty. These early journeys toward North America are not unified. There is no single plan, no shared vision. Different kingdoms send ships for different reasons. Some seek faster trade routes to Asia. Some chase rumors of gold. Some hope to expand faith. Others simply hope to survive by finding something new to claim. Colonization, at this stage, is not yet settlement. It is curiosity mixed with desperation. As ships push westward, the ocean becomes a long, quiet trial. Days blur together. Sails strain and relax with the wind. Men mark time by prayer, by ration, by the slow movement of the sun. The sea is not dramatic every day. Often, it is calm, almost gentle, rocking bodies into uneasy sleep. It is in these quiet stretches that fear grows loudest. Doubt whispers. The idea of turning back becomes tempting. But momentum carries them onward. Eventually, land appears not as a triumph, but as a pause. A low line against the sky. A darkening of the water. A smell carried on the wind that does not belong to the sea. When ships anchor near unfamiliar shores, the moment is hushed. No banners fly yet. No declarations are spoken aloud. There is only observation. The land does not look empty. Smoke rises faintly from inland fires. Paths appear where grass is pressed low. The forests seem deeper than expected. The silence is not absence, but presence waiting to be understood. For the people who arrive, this is both unsettling and reassuring. If others live here, survival may be possible. If others live here, nothing will be simple. Early contact is cautious. Europeans step ashore slowly, testing ground, tasting water, scanning tree lines. Their gestures are tentative. Gifts are offered. Words are exchanged without shared language. Meaning is guessed through tone and movement. Each side studies the other carefully, reading posture as much as expression. These moments are fragile. They can tilt toward cooperation or fear with a single misstep. A misunderstood motion. A raised voice. A hand reaching too quickly. Trust, when it forms, is thin and conditional. But it does form. Trade begins. Knowledge is exchanged. Directions are given. Warnings are shared about seasons, about food, about weather that does not behave as expected. Still, the Europeans do not fully understand what they are stepping into. They see land through the lens of ownership, of lines and boundaries, of resources waiting to be used. The indigenous peoples they meet understand land as relationship, as inheritance shared across generations. These differences do not erupt immediately. They rest beneath the surface, quiet and unresolved. Back across the ocean, reports return home. Letters are read aloud in court chambers and counting houses. Maps are redrawn with slightly firmer lines. The idea of North America begins to take shape not as rumor, but as possibility. The language changes. Words like settlement and colony begin to appear. What began as exploration slowly turns toward permanence. Ships return again. And again. Some do not return at all. Each voyage brings more certainty and more misunderstanding. Supplies are misjudged. Winters prove harsher than expected. Crops fail in unfamiliar soil. And yet, the pull remains strong. Land is still land. Distance still promises opportunity. By the end of this early period, something irreversible has begun. Not yet conquest. Not yet domination. But presence. A steady, growing presence that does not intend to leave. Small footholds form along coasts and rivers. Temporary camps harden into wooden structures. Names are given where none were needed before. As I linger here in part 1, I feel the weight of this beginning. Not dramatic, not explosive, but slow and deliberate. History does not arrive all at once. It seeps in, tide by tide, decision by decision. And so, as night deepens around us, we pause here. With ships still offshore. With fires still small. With futures not yet fully imagined. In the hush of this moment, we prepare to drift onward into part 2, where the first fragile settlements begin to take root and the land itself starts to shape those who have come to stay. In part 2, we remain close to the shoreline, where intentions begin to settle and uncertainty takes on a more permanent shape. The ships have come and gone enough times now that their arrivals no longer feel accidental. Wood is cut. Shelters are raised. Fires are tended not for a night, but for a season. This is the moment when presence turns quietly into settlement. I imagine myself walking through one of these early colonial outposts in its first year. The structures are modest and uneven. Walls lean slightly. Roofs are patched with whatever could be found. Smoke curls gently upward, carrying the scent of damp wood and unfamiliar food. Nothing here feels finished. Everything feels provisional, as if the land itself has not yet decided whether to allow this place to remain. Life is governed by practical concerns. Fresh water must be secured. Food must be grown or traded for. Illness moves quickly through cramped quarters. Tools wear down faster than expected. The earth resists familiar farming methods. Seeds brought from Europe do not always respond kindly to new soil. Seasons behave differently here, arriving earlier or later than anticipated, stretching longer than planned. And yet, there is hope. It appears quietly in small victories. A successful harvest from an adapted crop. A hunting trail learned and remembered. A shared meal that ends in laughter rather than exhaustion. These moments matter deeply. They convince people to stay when leaving would be easier. Relationships with indigenous communities remain central to survival. Knowledge flows unevenly but steadily. Europeans learn which plants are safe to eat, which waters freeze earliest, which signs in the sky signal danger. In return, metal tools and woven cloth circulate through trade networks. These exchanges are not equal, but they are necessary. Without them, many settlements would fade as quickly as they appeared. Still, tension begins to thicken the air. Settlements take up space. Forests are cleared. Hunting patterns shift. Paths become roads. What was once seasonal use becomes permanent claim. The change is subtle at first. Trees fall one by one. Fences appear slowly. But permanence has a weight to it, and the land feels it long before words are spoken. Within the settlements themselves, life is shaped by strict routines. Days begin early. Bells may ring to mark prayer or labor. Rules are written and enforced quickly. Order feels essential in a place where chaos waits just beyond the tree line. Authority often rests in the hands of a few. Governors, company leaders, religious figures. Their decisions carry outsized consequences. Faith plays a powerful role here. For some settlers, this land represents spiritual refuge. A place to practice belief without interference. Worship becomes a daily anchor, a way to impose familiarity on unfamiliar ground. For others, faith justifies expansion. It frames settlement as destiny rather than choice. These interpretations coexist uneasily, shaping how communities govern themselves and interact with others. Not all who arrive intend to stay forever. Some see these settlements as stepping stones. A chance to gain land, wealth, or position before returning home transformed. Others arrive with no return in mind. Their roots must grow here or nowhere at all. These differing intentions shape how people treat the land and one another. Conflict does not always arrive loudly. Often it begins with misunderstanding. A boundary crossed unknowingly. A promise translated poorly. A trade expected but not fulfilled. When conflict does appear, it surprises those who believed cooperation would last indefinitely. Trust, once strained, is difficult to restore. Yet daily life continues even as tensions rise. Children are born who have never seen Europe. Their accents differ. Their memories begin here. For them, this land is not new. It is simply home. This quiet generational shift matters more than declarations or documents. It signals that colonization is no longer temporary. Nature remains an active participant in every decision. Storms undo months of work in a single night. Winters arrive with a sharpness that tests resolve. Disease spreads unpredictably, carried across oceans and into bodies with no resistance. Survival feels fragile, dependent on cooperation, preparation, and luck in equal measure. As I move through this part of the story, I feel the steady tightening of threads. What began as scattered attempts at settlement now starts to resemble a pattern. Coastal enclaves multiply. Rivers become highways of movement and exchange. Information travels faster than before. Competition between European powers grows sharper. Flags change. Names are replaced. Control shifts hands. For indigenous communities, the change is unmistakable now. Seasonal rhythms are interrupted. Sacred spaces are altered. Trade becomes dependency. Resistance takes many forms. Withdrawal. Negotiation. Defense. Survival requires constant adaptation. Nothing remains untouched. By the end of Part 2, the landscape itself carries signs of transformation. Clearings interrupt forests. Smoke rises where none rose before. Languages overlap in marketplaces and meeting grounds. The land listens quietly as new stories are laid atop old ones. We pause here, in this moment of uneasy balance. Settlements are no longer fragile experiments, but they are not yet dominant. The future remains unsettled, shaped by choices still being made. As the night deepens and our pace remains slow, we prepare to drift onward into Part 3, where expansion accelerates, competition intensifies, and the consequences of permanence begin to press more heavily upon everyone who calls this land home. In Part 3, the pace subtly quickens, though nothing yet feels rushed. The settlements we left behind in Part 2 no longer sit quietly at the water's edge. They have begun to lean outward, pressing gently but persistently into the land beyond. What was once survival has turned toward ambition, and ambition, once awakened, rarely rests. I picture the morning light spilling over a growing settlement. The air smells of earth freshly turned. Axes strike trees with practiced rhythm. Paths widen under repeated footsteps. What once felt tentative now feels routine. People move with purpose, not just to endure the day, but to shape the future. The land is no longer simply endured. It is measured, divided, and planned. European powers are paying closer attention now. Reports from across the Atlantic no longer speak only of hardship. They speak of profit, of timber, fur, fertile soil, of strategic rivers and defensible harbors. Competition sharpens. New ships arrive carrying not just settlers, but soldiers, administrators, and officials charged with enforcing claims made far away in rooms thick with smoke and ink. Boundaries begin to appear, first on paper, then in practice. Lines are drawn across maps with confidence that the land itself does not recognize. These borders overlap and contradict one another, but that does not stop them from being enforced. Flags are raised. Names are assigned. Authority is declared. For those living within the colonies, daily life grows more complex. Laws multiply. Taxes appear. Expectations shift. The freedom some settlers imagine begins to feel narrower as control tightens. Others welcome structure, seeing it as protection against uncertainty. Power concentrates in the hands of those who control land, trade, and weapons. Expansion pushes settlements inland along rivers that serve as quiet corridors into the continent. Boats glide where forests once stood untouched. Trading posts appear at strategic crossings. Each outpost becomes a seed for further growth, a foothold that invites more people, more goods, more conflict. Relationships with indigenous nations are strained now in ways that cannot be smoothed by trade alone. Treaties are negotiated and renegotiated, often misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented. Agreements made one season are ignored the next. The imbalance of power grows as European populations increase and access to weapons expands. Resistance takes firmer shape. Some indigenous groups choose strategic alliance, hoping to preserve autonomy by aligning with one colonial power against another. Others retreat deeper into the land. Some prepare for defense, recognizing that coexistence is giving way to displacement. These decisions are not unified or simple. They are shaped by geography, tradition, and the urgent need to survive. Violence, when it comes, is often sudden and devastating. It flares and then recedes, leaving long shadows behind. Settlements fortify themselves. Watchtowers rise. Militias form. Fear becomes a quiet companion, shaping how communities interact with both neighbors and strangers. Religion continues to exert influence, now intertwined with authority. Missionary efforts expand, seeking to reshape belief systems alongside landscapes. Conversion is framed as salvation, as order, as progress. Yet it often carries loss. Language fades. Rituals are suppressed. Identity is challenged at its roots. Children growing up in this era inherit a world already divided. They learn the land through stories shaped by settlement rather than memory. Their sense of belonging is tied to ownership rather than relationship. This generational shift deepens the permanence of colonization in ways that no single policy could accomplish. The environment responds quietly but relentlessly. Animal populations decline under sustained hunting. Forests thin. Soil erodes where farming methods fail to account for local conditions. Floods worsen as riverbanks are altered. Nature does not resist with intent, but it reacts all the same, reshaping plans without consultation. Back in Europe, distance dulls the reality of these changes. Decisions are made based on profit and prestige. Colonies become symbols of national strength. Losses are accepted as necessary costs. Those living on the ground feel the weight of these decisions most sharply, though their voices rarely travel far. As I move through this part of the story, I sense a narrowing of possibilities. Where earlier moments held multiple futures, choices now begin to lock paths into place. Expansion creates momentum. Momentum resists reversal. Yet even here, humanity persists in small, quiet ways. Shared meals across cultural lines. Moments of mercy amid conflict. Individuals who question the direction of events but feel powerless to stop them. These moments do not change the larger pattern, but they matter all the same. By the end of Part 3, colonization is no longer an uncertain experiment or a fragile presence. It is a force shaping the continent's future. The land carries the marks of intention. Power has taken root alongside settlement. We pause here, where movement feels inevitable and tension hums beneath the surface. As the night remains calm around us, we prepare to drift onward into Part 4, where empire tightens its grip, resistance grows more organized, and the consequences of expansion become impossible to ignore. In Part 4, the quiet momentum of expansion hardens into structure. What once felt like scattered growth now begins to resemble an organized system, layered with rules, expectations, and authority that stretch far beyond any single settlement. The colonies are no longer distant experiments. They are investments, extensions of power, and reflections of rival empires watching one another closely across the ocean. I imagine myself walking through a colonial town that has existed long enough to feel established. The buildings stand straighter now. Streets are more clearly defined. Market days bring steady noise rather than cautious murmurs. Goods from across the Atlantic sit beside items drawn from the land itself. There is a sense of routine, but also of surveillance. Authority is visible here. In uniforms. In posted notices. In the careful way people choose their words. Imperial control expresses itself through administration. Governors arrive with formal titles and written instructions. Councils form to interpret and enforce law. Taxes are levied to fund defense and expansion. Trade is regulated, favoring the interests of the crown over the needs of local communities. Colonists begin to feel the weight of decisions made far away by people who will never walk these streets. At the same time, the empires compete with one another openly now. Borders remain unstable, shifting with treaties signed in Europe after wars fought elsewhere. Settlements change hands without moving an inch. Flags are replaced. Allegiances are demanded. For those living in the colonies, loyalty becomes a survival strategy rather than a sentiment. Indigenous nations find themselves navigating an increasingly dangerous landscape. Where once they negotiated with individual settlements, they now face imperial systems that absorb agreements and erase accountability. Treaties multiply, but trust diminishes. Land promised to remain untouched is surveyed and divided. Roads cut through hunting grounds. Rivers once shared become controlled. Resistance grows more coordinated in response. Leaders emerge who understand both indigenous traditions and European tactics. Alliances form across tribal lines when survival demands unity. Knowledge of terrain becomes a powerful tool. Forests and rivers offer refuge where rigid military formations struggle to adapt. Violence, when it erupts, is no longer isolated. It follows patterns. Raids are met with reprisals. Retaliation escalates. Civilians on all sides bear the consequences. Fear shapes daily life, hardening attitudes and narrowing empathy. Stories of danger circulate widely, often exaggerated, always effective in justifying further expansion and control. Within colonial society, divisions deepen. Wealth concentrates in the hands of landowners and merchants who benefit from trade and imperial favor. Laborious struggle under increasing demands. Enslaved people are brought into the colonial system in growing numbers, their forced labor woven into the economic foundation of expansion. Their presence adds another layer of suffering and contradiction to a world already built on imbalance. Religion, too, becomes more institutionalized. Churches gain influence not just over belief, but over governance and social order. Morality is enforced alongside law. Dissent is discouraged. Uniformity is valued as stability. Yet beneath this surface order, doubt grows. Some colonists begin to question the fairness of imperial control. Others question the cost of expansion on both land and people. The natural world continues to change under sustained pressure. Fields spread outward. Wildlife retreats. Rivers are redirected. The land adapts unevenly, sometimes providing abundance, sometimes responding with drought or flood. These environmental shifts intensify competition and anxiety, reinforcing the desire for control even as control proves elusive. Children born into this era inherit a world shaped by authority rather than exploration. Their education teaches loyalty and obedience. Their understanding of history begins with settlement rather than arrival. Memory is curated, emphasizing progress while minimizing loss. This shaping of narrative matters deeply. It determines how future generations will justify their place on the land. Yet even within rigid systems, cracks appear. Smuggling undermines trade restrictions. Local councils resist imperial demands. Cultural exchange persists in quiet ways, through food, language, and shared survival strategies. These subtle resistances do not overturn empires, but they remind us that control is never absolute. As I sit with this part of the story, I feel the tension between order and unrest, between authority imposed and humanity pushing back. Colonization has become a machinery now, driven by profit, power, and ideology. But machines require constant maintenance. They strain. They overreach. By the close of Part 4, the continent is divided by empires, claimed by maps, and governed by distant powers. Yet stability remains fragile. Resistance has not been extinguished. Discontent simmers within colonial populations. The land itself continues to resist complete mastery. We pause here, in this moment of tightening control and growing strain. As the night remains calm and our pace stays unhurried, we prepare to drift onward into Part 5, where cracks widen, conflicts escalate, and the colonial world begins to reveal the limits of empire itself. In Part 5, the strain we sensed earlier begins to show more clearly. The colonial world still stands, still functions, but it does so with a quiet tension running through it, like a structure held upright by beams that have begun to creak. The promises of empire feel heavier now, and the costs of maintaining them are no longer abstract. They are felt in bodies, in fields, and in the uneasy silence that settles after conflict. I imagine myself moving slowly through a settlement that has grown large enough to feel crowded. The streets are busier than before. Voices overlap. Disagreements linger longer than they once did. Where there was once a shared focus on survival, there are now competing priorities. Merchants want fewer restrictions. Farmers want more land. Officials want obedience. Soldiers want order. These desires pull against one another, tightening the social fabric. Imperial demands increase steadily. More resources are required to defend borders that keep shifting. More taxes are collected to fund wars that feel distant to those paying for them. Trade regulations grow more restrictive, designed to benefit the empire rather than the colony. Colonists who once saw themselves as partners in expansion begin to feel like subjects instead. This dissatisfaction does not erupt all at once. It settles quietly into daily conversation. Complaints whispered in taverns. Frustration expressed in letters that may never be answered. Small acts of defiance that stop short of rebellion. The idea that authority might be questioned begins to take root, even if few are ready to voice it openly. For indigenous communities, the pressure is far more immediate. Expansion accelerates despite treaties meant to limit it. Settlements press inward, fragmenting territory and disrupting established ways of life. Hunting grounds shrink. Sacred spaces are altered or destroyed. Promises are broken with increasing frequency, often justified as necessity or progress. Resistance intensifies in response. It becomes more strategic, more coordinated, shaped by years of observing colonial patterns. Knowledge of terrain is used deliberately. Timing becomes precise. Survival depends not just on strength, but on adaptability and restraint. The cost of resistance is high, but the cost of surrender feels higher still. Violence grows more entrenched, woven into the rhythm of colonial life. Fortifications become permanent features. Armed patrols replace open movement. Fear is no longer episodic. It is expected. Children grow up accustomed to warnings and drills. The idea of safety becomes conditional, dependent on loyalty and location. At the same time, the colonial economy expands in ways that deepen inequality. Large plantations emerge alongside small farms. Enslaved labor becomes central to production, particularly in regions where crops demand constant, exhausting work. Human lives are measured in output and profit. This system enriches some while binding others into cycles of suffering that will echo far beyond this era. Within colonial society, moral contradictions grow harder to ignore. Ideas of freedom and opportunity coexist with systems of control and exploitation. Religious teachings about dignity and compassion sit uneasily beside practices that deny both. Some individuals begin to notice this dissonance and feel unsettled by it, even if they do not yet know how to respond. The land itself continues to reflect these tensions. Fields expand rapidly, sometimes beyond what the soil can sustain. Forests retreat further. Wildlife becomes scarce near settlements. When crops fail or storms strike, the consequences are more severe because there is less margin for recovery. Nature reminds everyone, quietly and persistently, that control is never complete. As empires compete more aggressively, the colonies become battlegrounds for conflicts rooted elsewhere. Wars fought in Europe ripple outward, reshaping alliances and borders in North America. Colonists are drawn into struggles that are not their own, asked to defend claims that feel increasingly distant from their daily lives. These wars bring temporary shifts in power but lasting disruption. Communities are uprooted. Trade routes collapse and re-emerge altered. Trust erodes further, replaced by suspicion and caution. Each conflict leaves behind unresolved grievances that feed the next. And yet, life continues even under this weight. People marry. Children are born. Crops are planted again after failure. Stories are told beside fires at night, offering comfort and continuity. These small acts of persistence matter. They remind us that history is lived one day at a time, even when shaped by forces far beyond individual control. As I linger in Part 5, I sense a turning point approaching. The systems that once promised order now generate unrest. Authority feels heavier, less secure. Resistance, in many forms, grows more confident. The future is still uncertain, but the direction of change is becoming clearer. We pause here, in this moment of pressure and possibility. The colonial world has not yet fractured, but it is no longer stable. As the night remains calm around us, we prepare to drift onward into Part 6, where challenges to imperial power become more explicit and the seeds of transformation begin to push through the surface of history. In Part 6, the quiet questioning that once lingered at the edges of colonial life begins to move closer to the center. What had been murmured now finds firmer voice. What had been endured now feels negotiable. The colonial world is still governed by empire, still shaped by authority imposed from afar, but the sense that this arrangement is permanent has begun to loosen. I imagine myself walking through a settlement at dusk. Lamps glow softly in windows. Conversations drift outward into the street. There is an energy here that feels different from before, not louder, but more focused. People speak with a careful intensity. Ideas are exchanged as deliberately as goods once were. The language of obligation is slowly joined by the language of rights. Imperial oversight grows heavier in response. Officials tighten regulations. Military presence becomes more visible. Laws are enforced with greater rigidity, not because they are effective, but because authority feels uncertain. Control, when questioned, often responds by hardening. This only deepens the divide between rulers and the ruled. Colonists who once identified closely with the empire now feel increasingly distant from it. They are asked to fund wars they did not choose, to follow laws that limit their livelihoods, to defer to decisions made without their input. The promise of opportunity that once drew people across the ocean feels narrower now, constrained by rules that serve distant interests. These frustrations do not exist in isolation. They are shared, discussed, compared. Printing presses spread ideas more quickly than ever before. Pamphlets circulate. Letters are copied and passed hand to hand. Arguments sharpen. Some call for reform within the imperial system. Others begin to imagine something more radical, though few yet dare to say it aloud. For indigenous nations, the pressures of this era remain relentless. Expansion continues despite mounting instability within colonial society. Settlements press further inland, driven by population growth and economic demand. Land loss accelerates. Resistance persists, but it is now met with greater force, justified by the language of security and control. At the same time, indigenous leaders observe the fractures forming within colonial power structures. They understand that empire is not monolithic, that alliances can shift, that internal conflict may offer moments of leverage or survival. Diplomacy becomes as strategic as resistance, shaped by generations of adaptation. The presence of enslaved people within the colonies also becomes more visibly entwined with these tensions. Their labor supports the very systems being questioned. Their lack of freedom stands in stark contrast to emerging discussions of liberty and rights. This contradiction is not lost on those living within it, though it is often avoided rather than addressed. Some enslaved individuals resist in quiet ways. By slowing work, by preserving culture, by escaping when opportunity arises. Others endure, holding on to hope through community and memory. Their experiences add depth and gravity to the colonial struggle, even when their voices are suppressed. Economic patterns shift as well. Local industries develop alongside imperial trade networks. Colonists become less dependent on imported goods, more confident in their ability to sustain themselves. This economic independence feeds political confidence, reinforcing the idea that self-governance might be possible. The land continues to shape these developments. Vast distances make enforcement difficult. Terrain complicates control. Forests and mountains provide refuge and isolation. Geography itself resists centralized authority, encouraging local solutions and identities to form. As I reflect on this part of the story, I sense a slow turning inward. Colonies that once defined themselves in relation to Europe begin to define themselves in relation to one another. Regional identities strengthen. Shared grievances create unexpected unity across differences that once seemed insurmountable. Yet fear remains a powerful force. Fear of reprisal. Fear of instability. Fear of losing what has been built, even if it was built imperfectly. These fears temper action, slowing change even as pressure builds. Violence does not yet dominate this moment, but it hovers at the edges of possibility. Militias drill more openly. Weapons are maintained rather than merely stored. Preparedness becomes a common topic of conversation, framed as prudence rather than defiance. Through all of this, daily life continues. Fields are planted. Markets open. Children learn trades and prayers. Ordinary rhythms persist, grounding people even as extraordinary ideas take shape. History, after all, unfolds alongside routine. By the end of Part 6, the colonial world stands at a threshold. Empire still exerts control, but it no longer commands unquestioned loyalty. Resistance has taken many forms, from open defiance to quiet refusal. The future feels closer now, less distant and abstract. We pause here, in this moment of gathering resolve and restrained anticipation. As the night remains calm and our pace remains unhurried, we prepare to drift onward into Part 7, where words give way to action, and the balance between empire and colony begins to shift in visible, irreversible ways. In Part 7, the careful restraint that defined the previous moment begins to thin. Words have been exchanged long enough to sharpen their edges. Ideas have circulated widely enough to take root. What once felt theoretical now presses toward action, not with sudden force, but with a steady inevitability that is difficult to ignore. I imagine myself standing at the edge of a town square in the early morning. The air is cool, carrying the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. People gather in small clusters, speaking quietly but with intent. There is no single leader directing this movement. Instead, there is a shared awareness that something has shifted. Authority is no longer invisible. It is being observed, evaluated, and, increasingly, challenged. Imperial officials sense this change. Their responses grow firmer, their language more absolute. Laws are enforced with less flexibility. Demonstrations of loyalty are expected rather than requested. Military presence becomes more deliberate, not merely defensive but symbolic. Power is displayed openly, as if visibility alone might restore certainty. For many colonists, this display has the opposite effect. It sharpens resentment rather than soothing it. The distance between those who govern and those who are governed feels wider than ever. Policies that once seemed tolerable now feel intrusive. Obedience becomes a point of contention rather than habit. Organized resistance begins to take clearer shape. Committees form to coordinate communication. Meetings are held behind closed doors. Plans are discussed in careful language. These efforts are not yet unified, but they are intentional. The idea of collective action gains strength through repetition and shared purpose. At the same time, divisions remain. Not all colonists agree on the path forward. Some fear the consequences of open defiance. Others remain loyal to the empire, seeing stability as preferable to uncertainty. Families find themselves split by belief as much as by geography. These internal fractures complicate every decision. Indigenous nations watch these developments with cautious attention. They have lived through cycles of conflict and negotiation long enough to recognize instability when it appears. Some see opportunity in the weakening of imperial control. Others see danger in the chaos that may follow. Strategies vary, shaped by local conditions and long memory. Enslaved people, too, exist within this charged atmosphere, though their agency is constrained by force. They hear the language of freedom spoken more frequently now, even if it is not meant for them. This dissonance is felt deeply. Acts of resistance, both quiet and bold, continue in ways that challenge the systems relying on their labor. Economic pressure intensifies the situation. Boycotts disrupt trade. Smuggling increases as regulations are defied. Markets become sites of tension rather than simple exchange. Each act of economic resistance sends a message that authority can be undermined without open violence. The landscape itself seems to hold its breath. Roads that once carried goods now carry messages. Taverns become hubs of discussion. Churches and meeting houses host debates that extend late into the night. The rhythm of daily life shifts subtly, infused with anticipation and unease. As I move through this part of the story, I feel the weight of choices narrowing. Options that once existed quietly slip away. Compromise feels less satisfying. Neutrality becomes harder to maintain. People begin to understand that inaction itself carries consequences. Small confrontations begin to occur. A shipment seized. A patrol challenged. A law openly defied. These incidents are contained, but they reverberate widely. Each one tests the boundaries of response, probing how far authority can be pushed before it pushes back. Fear and courage coexist uneasily. Fear of retaliation tempers action. Courage pushes it forward. Individuals wrestle with loyalty, identity, and responsibility. The question is no longer whether change is coming, but how it will arrive and who will shape it. Imperial forces prepare for escalation. Training increases. Supplies are stockpiled. Contingency plans are drawn. The machinery of control readies itself for resistance it can no longer dismiss as temporary unrest. Yet even here, moments of humanity persist. Neighbors help one another quietly. Messages of reassurance pass between families. Songs and stories offer comfort in uncertain times. These small gestures do not stop history's movement, but they soften its passage. By the end of Part 7, the colonial world feels balanced on a narrow edge. Authority remains intact, but its hold is visibly strained. Resistance has moved from idea to practice, from conversation to coordination. The next steps will carry greater risk and greater consequence. We pause here, in this charged stillness before momentum accelerates. The night remains calm around us, even as tension gathers beneath the surface. As we drift gently onward into Part 8, actions will become harder to reverse, and the colonial struggle will move unmistakably into a new phase, where the cost of choice becomes impossible to ignore. In Part 8, the moment of balance gives way to motion. The careful pauses that once slowed events can no longer hold them back. Decisions are made not because every outcome is clear, but because waiting feels more dangerous than acting. The colonial world moves forward now under its own momentum, shaped by choices that cannot be undone once taken. I imagine myself walking along a narrow road at dawn, where mist still clings low to the ground. Footsteps pass more frequently than before. Riders move with purpose. Messages travel quickly, carried by hand and memory rather than official seal. There is a sense that everyone knows something is happening, even if no single person can name it fully. Acts of resistance become more visible. They are no longer isolated or easily dismissed. Assemblies gather openly. Resolutions are passed and circulated. Symbols appear in public spaces, quiet but unmistakable. Authority is no longer assumed. It is tested, measured against lived experience, and found wanting by many. Imperial responses grow sharper in turn. Warnings are issued. Demonstrations of force are staged. Troops are positioned not just to defend, but to intimidate. The language of order dominates official proclamations, emphasizing obedience and consequence. Yet beneath this firmness lies uncertainty. Control requires cooperation, and cooperation is no longer guaranteed. Within the colonies, coordination strengthens. Networks that once shared ideas now share plans. Trust builds slowly, forged by shared risk. Differences of region, religion, and background do not disappear, but they are temporarily set aside in the face of common pressure. Unity, however imperfect, becomes a strategy. Daily life adapts to this new reality. People plan with contingency in mind. Supplies are stored rather than sold. Weapons are cleaned and hidden. Travel is undertaken with caution. Even ordinary conversations feel weighted, as if every word carries the potential to be remembered later. For indigenous nations, this period remains deeply complex. Some communities are drawn into the colonial struggle as allies, whether by choice or necessity. Others attempt to remain distant, recognizing that neither outcome promises security. The weakening of imperial authority offers opportunity, but also danger. Power vacuums rarely remain empty for long. The land continues to play a quiet role in shaping events. Distance complicates enforcement. Forests conceal movement. Rivers carry both goods and information. Geography favors those who know it intimately, reinforcing the value of local knowledge over distant command. Enslaved people navigate this moment with constrained agency but keen awareness. The language of resistance reaches them, even when not intended. Some seize moments of confusion to escape or resist. Others endure, watching closely as structures of power strain. The contradiction between calls for liberty and the reality of bondage becomes increasingly visible, even if not yet addressed. Economically, the colonies grow more self-reliant. Trade disruptions force innovation. Local production expands. Skills once considered secondary gain importance. This practical independence feeds confidence, reinforcing the belief that separation from imperial control might be survivable. Tension sharpens through confrontation rather than negotiation. Compromises proposed now feel insufficient. Trust has eroded too deeply. Each side interprets the other's actions as proof of bad faith. Escalation becomes easier than retreat. Small clashes occur with greater frequency. A shipment stopped. A patrol turned away. A law ignored openly. Each incident tests limits, probing responses. The absence of immediate collapse emboldens further action. Momentum builds through repetition. Emotion runs close to the surface. Fear and determination intermingle. Families prepare for outcomes they hope will not come. Communities debate how far to go, how much to risk. The future feels nearer now, pressing against the present. Imperial authorities face their own dilemmas. Concessions risk appearing weak. Force risks hardening opposition. Communication delays compound miscalculation. Decisions made in haste travel slowly, arriving too late or in altered form. Through it all, the ordinary rhythms of life persist, though altered. Fields are tended with one eye on the horizon. Children learn both lessons and caution. Gatherings carry an undercurrent of urgency. History moves not in grand gestures alone, but in these quiet adjustments to uncertainty. As I sit with this part of the story, I feel the narrowing of paths again. Options remain, but fewer than before. Each choice now carries visible consequence. Neutral ground shrinks. Commitment becomes unavoidable. By the end of Part 8, the colonial world stands firmly in motion. Resistance has momentum. Authority has lost its aura of inevitability. The balance of power is no longer theoretical. It is being tested day by day through action rather than argument. We pause here, in the midst of movement rather than stillness. The night remains calm around us, even as history quickens its pace. As we drift gently onward into Part 9, the distance between intention and outcome will grow shorter, and the costs of conflict will begin to show themselves more clearly across the land. In Part 9, the space between decision and consequence grows narrow. What once unfolded slowly now moves with a steady urgency, as if events themselves have learned to breathe faster. The colonial world no longer feels as though it is approaching change. It is living inside it. I imagine myself standing at the edge of a settlement as the sun rises. The air is tense but quiet, like the moment before a storm fully reveals itself. People move with purpose, but not haste. They have learned that caution matters now more than speed. Messages arrive daily. News travels unevenly, sometimes accurate, sometimes exaggerated, always unsettling. Confrontation becomes harder to avoid. Imperial authority responds to defiance with firmness that borders on force. Patrols increase. Orders are issued that leave little room for interpretation. The expectation of obedience is clear, but the willingness to comply is no longer assumed. Each interaction between authority and community carries the risk of escalation. Colonial resistance, once careful and symbolic, grows more assertive. Coordination improves. Plans are refined. Leaders emerge, not always by choice, but by necessity. They speak with the weight of shared grievance behind them, aware that their words now carry consequences beyond persuasion. The emotional landscape shifts alongside the political one. Fear deepens, but so does resolve. People begin to understand that retreat may no longer be possible without loss of dignity or safety. The idea of return to an earlier balance fades. The future, whatever it holds, must be faced rather than deferred. For indigenous nations, this period is marked by uncertainty layered upon uncertainty. The weakening of imperial control alters long-standing dynamics, but does not remove threat. Settler expansion continues, sometimes accelerated by instability elsewhere. Promises are broken more frequently as authority fragments. Survival demands constant reassessment of alliance and distance. Some indigenous communities find themselves drawn into conflicts not of their choosing, forced to defend land against encroachment while navigating shifting colonial power. Others attempt to remain unseen, retreating into familiar terrain. Each choice carries risk. None offer safety without cost. Enslaved people experience this moment through the narrow lens allowed to them, yet its impact is profound. Confusion within systems of control creates moments of opportunity and danger. Some resist more openly, emboldened by the instability around them. Others are punished harshly, as authorities seek to reassert dominance where they can. The contradiction between proclaimed ideals and lived reality sharpens further. Economic life becomes more volatile. Trade disruptions grow more severe. Scarcity replaces abundance in some regions. Prices rise. Hoarding becomes common. Markets feel strained, reflecting broader instability. These pressures feed discontent, making compromise even less appealing. Violence begins to appear more openly, though still not everywhere at once. Clashes occur along contested routes. Lives are lost in moments that later feel inevitable, though they were once unthinkable. Each loss leaves behind grief that hardens resolve rather than softens it. Imperial forces respond with increased presence, hoping visibility will restore order. Yet this presence often inflames tensions. Soldiers become symbols rather than protectors. Authority feels imposed rather than earned. The distance between command and community widens further. Daily life adapts again, shaped by expectation of conflict. Families prepare for displacement. Routes are planned carefully. Night watches become routine. Trust is measured cautiously. Even familiar faces are observed with new awareness. And still, humanity persists. Acts of kindness continue in small, stubborn ways. Neighbors share resources. Strangers offer shelter. These moments do not change the direction of history, but they remind us that people live within it, not above it. As I reflect on this part of the story, I feel the weight of inevitability growing heavier. Not because outcomes are predetermined, but because choices have accumulated. Each decision narrows the range of what can follow. History gathers itself from countless small acts. By the end of Part 9, the colonial world feels transformed. The old structures remain, but they no longer command loyalty without question. Resistance is no longer theoretical. It has shape, momentum, and consequence. Conflict, once distant, now feels close enough to touch. We pause here, not in calm anticipation, but in steady awareness. The night remains quiet around us, offering space to breathe even as events press forward. As we drift gently onward into Part 10, confrontation will become more direct, and the forces shaping North America will move decisively into open struggle, leaving little room for return to what once was. In Part 10, the tension that has been building through quiet decisions and measured defiance finally crosses into open struggle. What had once been shaped by restraint now moves with a clarity that is both sobering and irreversible. The colonial world has reached a point where authority and resistance can no longer share the same fragile space. I imagine myself standing at the edge of a settlement at first light. The morning feels different now. Not louder, not dramatic, but charged with awareness. People rise knowing that the day may demand more of them than labor or patience. Conversations are shorter. Preparations more deliberate. The possibility of confrontation is no longer abstract. It is expected. Imperial authority responds decisively. Troops are deployed with purpose rather than display. Orders are no longer warnings but commands. The language of compromise fades from official messages, replaced by the language of control and consequence. Empire, feeling its grip weaken, tightens its hold. For those within the colonies, this shift confirms what many already sensed. Negotiation has reached its limit. Appeals have been ignored or answered with force. The idea that obedience might restore balance no longer feels credible. Resistance, once cautious, now accepts risk as unavoidable. Open clashes begin to occur with greater frequency. They are often small, uneven, and chaotic. There is no single battlefield, no clear front. Conflict unfolds across roads, fields, rivers, and towns. Each encounter leaves behind fear and memory that spread faster than official reports. Communities are drawn into the struggle whether they choose it or not. Neutrality becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. To remain silent is often interpreted as opposition by one side or the other. People are forced to declare loyalty through action or inaction, each carrying consequence. Leadership emerges under pressure. Individuals step forward not because they seek power, but because coordination becomes necessary. Decisions must be made quickly. Resources allocated. Information shared. These leaders carry heavy burdens, aware that mistakes will cost lives. Imperial forces operate under their own strain. Distance complicates command. Orders arrive late or incomplete. Local conditions defy centralized planning. Soldiers face unfamiliar terrain and uncertain support. Authority, though armed, proves less agile than expected. For indigenous nations, this escalation deepens existing hardship. Their lands become corridors for movement and conflict. Their communities are disrupted by battles that are not theirs, yet directly affect them. Some are coerced into alliance. Others are targeted regardless of intent. Survival grows more precarious as instability spreads. The land itself absorbs the weight of conflict. Fields are trampled. Forests conceal movement and loss. Rivers carry both supplies and stories of violence downstream. nature does not distinguish between cause and effect. It bears witness quietly. Enslaved people experience this upheaval through an even narrower margin of safety. Systems of control grow harsher as authorities fear losing grip. Yet moments of chaos also create openings. Some seize them. Others are crushed by them. The struggle for freedom remains unresolved, intensified by contradiction rather than clarity. Economic life fractures further. Trade routes collapse under threat. Scarcity becomes common. Communities rely more heavily on one another, even as trust erodes. Survival becomes communal out of necessity rather than choice. Fear becomes a daily companion. Not paralyzing, but persistent. It sharpens attention, alters behavior. People listen more closely to the night. They learn to read signs in silence and movement. The world feels smaller, defined by what can be defended. And yet, courage persists alongside fear. Not the kind that seeks glory, but the kind that continues despite exhaustion. The courage to stand watch, to carry messages, to care for the wounded. These acts sustain resistance as much as strategy does. As I sit with this part of the story, I feel the gravity of transformation. The colonial world has crossed a threshold. Authority and resistance are now openly opposed. The outcome remains uncertain, but the process is underway. History, in moments like this, does not move with clarity. It moves through confusion, loss, and determination. People act with incomplete information, guided by belief, fear, and hope in equal measure. By the end of Part 10, the struggle is no longer contained. It has spread across regions and lives. The old order has been challenged openly, and the response has been forceful. Whatever comes next will be shaped by the endurance of those living through it and the limits of power stretched too far. We pause here, in the midst of open conflict, where the air feels heavier and the future less distant. The night remains calm around us, offering a moment of quiet reflection. As we drift gently onward into Part 11, the struggle will deepen, sacrifices will grow more visible, and the shape of a new world will begin to emerge from the strain of what is being contested. In Part 11, the struggle settles into a grim rhythm. What began as confrontation now becomes endurance. The shock of open conflict fades, replaced by the slower, heavier weight of living within it. The colonial world has adjusted to instability, not because it is accepted, but because it can no longer be avoided. I imagine myself walking through a settlement at dusk, where signs of strain are visible everywhere. Buildings bear marks of hurried repair. Supplies are stacked carefully, counted more than once. Faces look older than they did before, shaped by worry and long days. Conversation has changed too. It is quieter, more practical, less speculative. People speak of what must be done rather than what might happen. Conflict no longer arrives as surprise. It is expected, prepared for, and woven into daily planning. Routes are chosen for safety. Watches are set at night. Messages travel along established networks, faster now, though never fast enough. Each report carries both information and emotion, shaping decisions far from where events unfold. Leadership becomes more structured under pressure. Roles are defined. Chains of responsibility take shape. Decisions are debated, but time limits debate. The need to act outweighs the desire for certainty. Those who lead do so under constant scrutiny, knowing that trust is fragile and easily broken. Imperial forces adapt as well. They reorganize, learning from early failures. Strategies shift toward containment and control rather than swift resolution. Authority asserts itself through presence, patrols, and punishment. Yet even as tactics improve, certainty remains elusive. Resistance does not dissolve as expected. It persists, reshaping itself around obstacles. For many colonists, the reality of prolonged struggle brings both resolve and fatigue. Initial enthusiasm gives way to sobering awareness. Sacrifice becomes personal. Loss touches families and communities directly. The cost of resistance is no longer theoretical. It is counted in lives altered and futures narrowed. Indigenous nations endure this phase with deepening vulnerability. Their lands continue to be traversed, claimed, and fought over. Autonomy erodes further as conflict disrupts traditional rhythms. Some communities are forced into repeated displacement. Others face violence regardless of alignment. Survival becomes an act of constant negotiation with forces beyond control. The environment bears these pressures visibly now. Fields lie fallow where labor is diverted. Forests thin as wood is taken for fortifications and fuel. Wildlife retreats further. The land reflects exhaustion alongside its inhabitants, altered by sustained use and neglect. Enslaved people experience intensified hardship during this period. Control tightens as authorities fear disorder. Surveillance increases. Punishment becomes harsher. Yet even under these conditions, resistance continues in quiet forms. Preservation of culture. Shared memory. Small acts of defiance that assert humanity in systems designed to deny it. Economic strain deepens across regions. Shortages spread unevenly. Wealth concentrates where control of resources is strongest. Inequality sharpens resentment, even among those aligned in struggle. Unity, though necessary, is tested by scarcity and fear. Amid this hardship, communities develop new forms of resilience. Mutual aid becomes essential. Skills are shared. Roles shift. People adapt to circumstances that once seemed impossible. These adaptations do not erase suffering, but they allow life to continue within it. Emotion settles into a steady undercurrent rather than sharp spikes. Fear remains, but it is familiar now. Courage becomes quieter, expressed through persistence rather than dramatic action. Hope narrows, focusing on immediate goals rather than distant visions. As I reflect on this part of the story, I feel the weight of time pressing differently. History no longer feels like a series of turning points. It feels like duration. Like endurance measured not in moments, but in months and years of sustained effort. The idea of return to an earlier world fades further. Even if conflict were to end suddenly, its effects would remain. Relationships have shifted. Trust has been altered. The landscape itself has changed. Whatever emerges next will be built on these altered foundations. By the end of Part 11, the colonial world exists fully within struggle. Authority remains contested. Resistance persists despite cost. No clear resolution is visible yet. What is clear is that this conflict is reshaping identities, loyalties, and expectations across the continent. We pause here, in this long middle of history, where endurance matters as much as action. The night around us remains calm, offering a gentle contrast to the strain of the story. As we drift softly onward into Part 12, the consequences of prolonged conflict will begin to crystallize, revealing how sustained struggle transforms not just power, but the very idea of what this land and its people might become. In Part 12, the long strain of conflict begins to settle into something quieter but no less transformative. The sharp edges of urgency soften, not because tensions disappear, but because people learn how to live alongside them. What once felt like constant crisis becomes a background presence, shaping choices subtly and persistently. I imagine myself walking through a settlement in the early evening. The sky dims slowly, and lanterns are lit one by one. There is less movement than before, but also less panic. People know what to expect now. They have learned the rhythms of uncertainty. They plan not for perfect outcomes, but for survivable ones. The struggle has altered priorities. Grand declarations matter less than steady reliability. Those who can provide food, repair tools, or carry messages safely gain quiet respect. Leadership becomes less about speeches and more about endurance. The people who remain visible are those who show up consistently, who listen, who adapt. Imperial authority still exists, but it feels thinner now, stretched across distance and resistance. Orders continue to arrive, but they are interpreted through local realities. Enforcement is uneven. Control depends increasingly on negotiation, even when it claims otherwise. The image of absolute power fades, replaced by something more fragile and reactive. For colonists, this shift creates space for reflection. The cost of prolonged struggle invites questions that could once be postponed. What is being fought for? What will remain afterward? Whether the structures being resisted might be replaced by something different, or simply inherited in new hands. These questions linger in conversations late at night, unspoken but present. Indigenous nations continue to navigate an exhausting landscape of pressure and change. The instability of colonial authority brings neither relief nor clarity. Some regions experience temporary reprieve as attention shifts elsewhere. Others face intensified encroachment as settlements seek security through expansion. Adaptation remains constant, shaped by memory, land knowledge, and hard-earned caution. The land itself shows signs of prolonged use. Paths widen into roads. Temporary camps leave lasting marks. Rivers carry traces of movement and industry. The environment does not protest, but it records. It holds evidence quietly, shaping future possibilities without comment. Enslaved people live through this phase with deep awareness of contradiction. The language of endurance and sacrifice circulates widely, often excluding them. Their labor continues to sustain communities under strain. Control remains harsh, but cracks appear in its certainty. Moments of instability offer both risk and opportunity, neither predictable nor safe. Economic life stabilizes unevenly. Some regions adapt successfully, building systems that function despite disruption. Others struggle under scarcity and loss. Trade resumes in altered forms. Barter replaces currency in some places. Value becomes local, defined by need rather than distant markets. Communities grow more inwardly focused. Shared hardship strengthens bonds among some, while isolating others. Trust becomes precious and carefully managed. Outsiders are viewed with caution. Familiar faces gain importance simply by remaining. Emotion settles into something quieter. Not despair, but a tempered awareness. People grieve losses without ceremony. They celebrate small continuities. A successful harvest. A birth. A peaceful night. These moments do not erase conflict, but they anchor life within it. As I move through this part of the story, I feel history shifting from momentum to consequence. The actions taken earlier now reveal their long-term effects. Systems bend. Identities change. Expectations adjust. The future is still uncertain, but it is no longer imagined in the same way. The idea of resolution begins to feel distant, replaced by acceptance that transformation takes time. The land and its people are being reshaped gradually, through endurance rather than climax. What emerges will reflect not just victories or losses, but the capacity to persist. By the end of Part 12, the colonial world feels altered at a fundamental level. Authority is no longer unquestioned. Resistance has become habitual rather than reactive. Communities have adapted to a reality that once felt unbearable. We pause here, in this quieter stretch of history, where change unfolds slowly and deeply. The night remains calm around us, offering space to rest within the story. As we drift gently onward into Part 13, the focus will turn toward what endures after struggle, and how the lessons of prolonged conflict begin to shape visions of what this land might become when the noise finally fades. In Part 13, attention shifts from the strain of conflict itself to what lingers afterward. The struggle has not ended, but it has settled deeply enough into the land and its people that its influence can be felt even in moments of quiet. This is the part of the story where endurance turns into memory, and memory begins to guide the shape of what comes next. I imagine myself walking along a well-worn path just beyond a settlement at dawn. The ground is firm beneath my feet, pressed smooth by years of use. Birds move through the trees cautiously, as if they too have learned to listen more carefully. The world feels alert, but not frantic. Life continues, shaped by lessons learned slowly and often painfully. Communities now carry a shared understanding that stability, when it comes, will not resemble the past. The old assumptions have been stripped away. Authority is no longer trusted simply because it exists. Promises are measured against experience. People listen for what is unsaid as much as what is spoken. This cautious awareness becomes a defining trait of life in the colonies. Leadership evolves again during this phase. The most trusted figures are no longer those who speak the loudest or command the most force, but those who navigate complexity with patience. Negotiation becomes as valued as resistance. Adaptability is recognized as strength rather than compromise. These shifts do not erase conflict, but they change how it is approached. For colonists, identity begins to solidify in new ways. They speak less of distant homelands and more of shared experience on this continent. The land itself becomes central to how they understand who they are. Seasons, terrain, and survival shape their sense of belonging more than inherited titles or traditions. A new identity, still forming and still uneven, begins to take root. Indigenous nations continue to live with the heaviest consequences of transformation. Their endurance carries a different weight, rooted in continuity rather than emergence. Knowledge passed down across generations becomes even more vital. Stories preserve memory where land has been taken. Ceremony adapts to new realities. Survival remains an active process, shaped by resilience rather than resolution. The land holds these layers of history quietly. Old paths intersect with new roads. Cleared fields sit beside untouched forest. Rivers carry the marks of industry alongside reflections of sky. Nothing here exists in isolation. Every change is layered atop what came before, altering but not erasing it. Enslaved people remain bound within systems that show little sign of release, even as ideals of liberty circulate more widely. Their presence exposes the deepest contradictions of this era. Endurance here is not chosen, but forced. And yet, culture, memory, and resistance persist in ways that defy erasure. Songs, stories, and shared rituals sustain identity where freedom is denied. Economically, patterns begin to settle into longer-term structures. Some regions recover and grow. Others remain fragile. Inequality becomes more entrenched, woven into systems of land ownership and labor. These structures will shape future conflicts, even if they are not fully recognized yet. Emotionally, people carry a quiet weariness. Not despair, but a tempered outlook shaped by experience. Optimism exists, but it is cautious. Hope focuses on continuity rather than transformation. People invest in what they can touch and tend. Homes. Families. Small plots of land. These anchors provide meaning when larger outcomes remain uncertain. As I move through this part of the story, I sense a turning inward. The energy that once fueled confrontation now feeds reflection. People begin to ask not just how to survive, but how to live with what has been endured. These questions are not answered quickly. They linger, shaping choices subtly over time. The idea of the future becomes more grounded. Grand visions give way to practical imagination. What kind of community can endure? What values can be preserved? What mistakes must not be repeated? These considerations do not dominate conversation, but they influence it steadily. By the end of Part 13, the colonial world feels quieter, but no less complex. The struggle has left marks that cannot be undone. Yet within those marks lies the possibility of learning, of shaping something informed by experience rather than illusion. We pause here, in this reflective space where memory and possibility meet. The night remains calm around us, offering rest without forgetting. As we drift gently onward into Part 14, attention will turn toward how these emerging identities and lessons begin to influence the broader direction of the continent, setting patterns that will echo long after the conflicts themselves fade from daily life. In Part 14, the story widens its lens. What has been forming quietly within settlements, communities, and memory now begins to shape the broader direction of the continent itself. The struggle, the endurance, the adaptations. All of it starts to settle into patterns that will last far beyond the moment that created them. I imagine myself standing on a gentle rise overlooking a wide stretch of land at early morning. Mist moves slowly across fields and forests alike. From this distance, no single settlement dominates the view. Instead, there is a sense of spread, of human presence woven into the land rather than clustered tightly at its edges. The continent feels fuller now, more densely layered with intention. Colonial communities have learned how to exist without constant reference to empire. Authority still exists, but it no longer defines daily life as completely as it once did. Local decisions matter more. Regional customs take shape. Differences between areas become more pronounced, shaped by geography, climate, and history. A shared experience binds people loosely, but identity becomes increasingly local. This regionalization has lasting effects. People begin to see neighboring colonies not just as outposts of the same power, but as distinct places with their own priorities and rhythms. Cooperation exists, but so does competition. Trade routes shift. Alliances change. These dynamics create a complex web of relationships that no single authority fully controls. For colonists, this period marks a deepening sense of belonging to the land itself. Ownership, however unevenly distributed, becomes central to identity. Land is measured, inherited, defended. It shapes family structure, labor, and ambition. The idea of permanence settles more firmly into the colonial imagination. Indigenous nations continue to navigate a world reshaped around them. Some find ways to maintain continuity through adaptation, preserving language and tradition within changing landscapes. Others face increasing pressure as expansion becomes normalized rather than contested. Their presence remains foundational to the continent's story, even as efforts are made to marginalize or erase it. The land reflects these layered realities. Roads multiply, connecting regions once isolated. Rivers serve as arteries of movement and exchange. Forests retreat unevenly. Fields expand where soil allows. These changes are not uniform. They create a patchwork landscape that mirrors the uneven distribution of power and opportunity. Enslaved people remain at the center of this transformation, though rarely acknowledged as such. Their labor underpins agricultural expansion and economic stability in many regions. Generations are born into bondage, shaping culture and resistance in ways that will endure. Their forced presence leaves an indelible mark on the continent's social fabric. Economically, the continent becomes more self-sustaining. Local industries grow. Craftsmanship flourishes where imports once dominated. This independence reinforces emerging identities, reducing reliance on distant powers. At the same time, inequality deepens. Wealth accumulates where land and labor intersect most profitably. Poverty persists where access is limited. Culturally, traditions evolve. Language shifts subtly, influenced by place and proximity. Foodways adapt to local resources. Stories incorporate landscape and experience rather than distant origin. Memory becomes localized, shaped by what communities have endured together. Emotionally, people carry both weariness and resolve. The memory of conflict lingers, but it no longer dominates every thought. Attention turns toward continuity. Toward building something that can last, even if imperfect. The future is imagined cautiously, grounded in experience rather than idealism. As I reflect on this part of the story, I sense history settling into its long form. The dramatic arcs of confrontation give way to quieter forces. Habit, tradition, inheritance. These are the mechanisms that shape centuries, not moments. The continent itself becomes a participant in this process. Its vastness resists uniform control. Its diversity encourages divergence. The land does not allow a single narrative to dominate fully. Instead, it holds many stories at once, overlapping and unresolved. By the end of Part 14, the foundations of what North America will become are more clearly visible. Not as a finished structure, but as a framework. Identities rooted in land rather than empire. Systems shaped by endurance rather than decree. Conflicts embedded into social and economic patterns rather than confined to battlefields. We pause here, in this wide, reflective moment, where history stretches forward as much as it looks back. The night around us remains calm, offering rest even as the story continues its slow unfolding. As we drift gently onward into Part 15, we will begin to explore how these patterns solidify across generations, carrying the legacy of colonization into the lives of those who will inherit a continent already shaped by centuries of struggle, adaptation, and persistence. In Part 15, time stretches forward, carrying the weight of earlier choices into the lives of those who did not witness their making. The focus shifts gently from the generation that endured upheaval to those who inherit its outcomes. Colonization is no longer experienced as an event. It is lived as environment, structure, and assumption. I imagine myself walking through a village where the oldest residents remember conflict, but the youngest know it only through story. The buildings feel settled now. Paths are worn smooth. Trees planted after the hardest years have grown tall enough to cast shade. There is a sense of continuity here, though it is layered over memory rather than built upon peace. Children grow up surrounded by boundaries they did not draw. Property lines, social roles, and expectations feel natural because they have always existed. What was once imposed becomes familiar. Education teaches not just skills, but perspective. History is told selectively, emphasizing endurance and progress while softening loss. Memory is shaped as much by silence as by story. For colonists, generational identity becomes more firmly rooted in place. Accents change. Customs evolve. The idea of origin shifts from elsewhere to here. Belonging is defined less by ancestry and more by land, labor, and shared experience. This sense of rootedness strengthens community, but it also hardens attitudes toward those seen as outside it. Indigenous nations experience this generational passage differently. Memory remains active rather than distant. Stories carry responsibility as well as identity. Elders speak of land not just as territory, but as relation. The challenge is not remembering what was lost, but sustaining what remains. Adaptation continues, shaped by resilience and careful negotiation with a world that has normalized their displacement. The land itself carries generational change visibly. Fields once cleared hastily are now cultivated methodically. Roads become permanent. Rivers are redirected with confidence born of long use. These changes feel ordinary to those who inherit them, though they would have seemed radical to those who first enacted them. Enslaved people and their descendants live within an inheritance of constraint. Bondage is not new to them. It is structure. It defines childhood, labor, and possibility. Yet within this imposed continuity, culture deepens. Language, music, belief, and kinship endure and evolve. Resistance becomes quieter, woven into daily survival rather than overt confrontation. Economically, systems solidify across generations. Land ownership concentrates. Labor roles become entrenched. Opportunity narrows or widens based on position within these structures. Mobility exists, but unevenly. Prosperity and hardship are inherited alongside names and property. Social hierarchies grow more complex and more rigid. Class distinctions sharpen. Race becomes codified into law and custom. These divisions are taught explicitly and implicitly, shaping interactions long before they are questioned. Injustice becomes normalized not through cruelty alone, but through repetition. Emotionally, the weight of history settles into habit. The urgency of earlier struggle fades, replaced by routines that carry its consequences quietly. People work, marry, raise children, and plan futures within systems they did not choose. Discontent exists, but it is often localized, focused on immediate concerns rather than structural origins. As I move through this part of the story, I feel the quiet power of inheritance. not inheritance of wealth alone, but of worldview. The way people understand land, authority, and one another is shaped by generations of lived experience. Change becomes slower now, resisted not by force, but by familiarity. And yet, seeds of questioning remain. Education spreads unevenly, but ideas travel. Observations accumulate. Comparisons are made between ideals and realities. These tensions do not erupt immediately. They wait, gathering beneath the surface of normalcy. The environment responds to generational use with its own slow adjustments. Soil is exhausted in some regions, enriched in others. Waterways are altered permanently. Wildlife adapts or disappears. These changes shape livelihoods and movement, influencing where communities thrive or falter. By the end of Part 15, colonization has fully transitioned into legacy. It is no longer something being built. It is something being lived with. The continent carries structures that feel stable, even as they contain unresolved tensions that will shape future generations. We pause here, in this long view of inheritance and habit. The night around us remains calm, offering a gentle space to rest within the story. As we drift softly onward into Part 16, attention will turn toward the subtle pressures that build within established systems, and how even the most familiar structures can begin to shift when questioned by those who have known nothing else. In Part 16, the settled world begins to feel less certain beneath its own familiarity. The structures that once offered stability now show signs of strain, not through collapse, but through quiet discomfort. This is the phase where people who have known nothing else start to sense that what surrounds them is not inevitable, only inherited. I imagine myself walking through a town that feels well established. The buildings are sturdy. The routines are reliable. Markets open on schedule. Bells mark time. And yet, beneath this order, there is restlessness. Conversations linger a moment longer than they used to. Questions surface gently, often disguised as practical concerns, but carrying deeper weight. Those born into this world begin to compare what they have been taught with what they observe. Ideals spoken aloud do not always align with daily reality. Opportunity is uneven. Authority feels distant or unresponsive. The rules that govern life appear less neutral when examined closely. These realizations do not arrive dramatically. They accumulate slowly, shaped by experience rather than argument. Education plays a quiet role here. Literacy spreads. Access to ideas expands beyond local tradition. People read accounts from other regions. They encounter perspectives that mirror their own doubts or challenge long-held assumptions. Knowledge does not immediately disrupt the system, but it introduces friction. Once seen, inconsistencies cannot be unseen. For colonist communities, this questioning often centers on fairness and voice. Who decides? Who benefits? Who bears cost? These questions surface in discussions about taxes, land access, and law. They are framed as practical disputes, yet they reflect deeper unease with inherited hierarchies. Indigenous nations continue to experience pressure from systems that have normalized their marginalization. Yet within this phase, their endurance remains a source of continuity. Memory does not fade here. It informs identity and strategy. Younger generations learn to navigate imposed systems while holding onto knowledge that predates them. Survival remains active, deliberate, and deeply rooted. Enslaved people and their descendants feel these tensions with particular clarity. The language of order and tradition offers little comfort when it justifies confinement. Awareness grows through shared experience and quiet communication. Resistance adapts again, shaped by caution and persistence. Hope exists, but it is guarded, shaped by long familiarity with disappointment. Economically, established systems begin to feel restrictive to those on their margins. Laborious question terms once accepted as fixed. Small landholders struggle against consolidation. The promise of upward movement proves elusive for many. Frustration grows not from sudden deprivation, but from sustained limitation. The land reflects this stage subtly. Fields are productive, but stressed. Towns expand, but unevenly. Infrastructure supports growth while revealing its limits. Crowding, depletion, and dependency introduce new challenges that earlier generations did not face in the same way. Emotionally, people carry a quiet dissatisfaction that does not yet have language. It expresses itself through impatience, withdrawal, or subtle defiance. Traditions are followed, but less reverently. Authority is obeyed, but questioned internally. Loyalty becomes conditional rather than assumed. As I move through this part of the story, I sense the beginning of internal pressure. Not rebellion, not collapse, but awareness. The kind that unsettles without yet mobilizing. History often shifts this way, through recognition before action. Communities respond unevenly. Some double down on tradition, seeking comfort in certainty. Others experiment cautiously, adjusting practices to better suit lived reality. These responses coexist, creating tension within and between groups. The environment continues to influence these dynamics. Limited resources sharpen competition. Changing conditions force adaptation. The land, once a symbol of abundance, now requires careful management. This reality challenges narratives of endless growth and opportunity. By the end of Part 16, the world shaped by colonization feels stable on the surface but unsettled beneath. The systems that once seemed permanent now feel subject to question. Not yet threatened, but no longer beyond scrutiny. We pause here, in this quiet moment of recognition. The night around us remains calm, offering space to rest even as understanding deepens. As we drift gently onward into Part 17, these questions will begin to gather momentum, moving from private thought toward shared conversation, and setting the stage for shifts that will once again reshape the direction of this land and its people. In Part 17, the questions that once lived quietly within individuals begin to find one another. What was private unease becomes shared conversation. What was felt but unnamed starts to gather language. This is not a moment of sudden upheaval, but of connection. Awareness recognizes itself in others, and that recognition changes its weight. I imagine myself sitting near a hearth as evening settles in. Outside, the wind moves gently through familiar trees. Inside, voices rise and fall in careful rhythm. People speak not to persuade, but to understand whether their thoughts are shared. The relief of recognition is subtle but powerful. To realize that doubt is not isolation, but experience, is to feel the ground shift slightly beneath one's feet. Conversations begin to extend beyond practical complaint. They touch on fairness, on voice, on belonging. Not loudly, not defiantly, but steadily. People compare experiences across towns and regions. They notice patterns. What once seemed personal now appears structural. The realization is quiet, but it does not fade. Printed words play an important role here. Essays, Pamphlets and letters circulate more widely, carried by trade routes and shared hands. They give shape to feelings that were once vague. Language sharpens understanding. Ideas are tested, debated, refined. Reading becomes an act of connection rather than solitude. For colonist communities, this shared questioning deepens regional identities while also revealing common ground. Differences remain, shaped by geography and economy, but they are now discussed openly. Cooperation begins to feel possible where it once felt impractical. The idea of collective voice takes root, tentative but growing. Indigenous nations observe these developments with layered awareness. They have long understood the instability of imposed systems. The emergence of colonial self-questioning does not erase harm, but it does alter dynamics. Some communities engage cautiously, seeking protection or leverage where possible. Others remain guarded, shaped by memory that counsels restraint. Endurance continues, informed by experience rather than expectation. Enslaved people and their descendants exist within this awakening differently. The language of questioning reaches them, but often without invitation. Still, it resonates. Awareness of contradiction grows sharper. The gap between proclaimed values and lived reality becomes harder to ignore. Resistance adapts again, expressed through survival, culture, and moments of refusal that affirm humanity in constrained spaces. Economically, shared dissatisfaction finds expression in coordinated response. Agreements are challenged. Practices are negotiated. Cooperation among laborious, small landholders, and traders increases. These efforts are not revolutionary in form, but they signal a shift from individual adaptation to collective consideration. The land itself witnesses this change quietly. Gathering places become more important. Roads carry not just goods, but ideas. Taverns, meeting houses, and marketplaces serve as spaces of exchange beyond commerce. Geography shapes dialogue, connecting some communities while isolating others, influencing how awareness spreads. Emotionally, there is a sense of cautious momentum. Hope appears, but it is restrained, shaped by long familiarity with disappointment. People do not expect immediate change. They begin instead to imagine possibility. This imagination is careful, grounded, and persistent. As I move through this part of the story, I feel the gentle hum of alignment. Not unity in belief, but recognition of shared condition. History often turns this way, not through dramatic declaration, but through the quiet realization that many are standing on similar ground. Authority responds in varied ways. Some acknowledge concerns, offering limited accommodation. Others resist, reinforcing tradition and hierarchy. These responses influence how far and how fast conversations travel. Tension grows not from confrontation, but from divergence between expectation and response. Within families, these shifts are felt intimately. Generations speak past one another at times. Elders recall hardship that taught caution. Younger voices carry urgency shaped by constraint rather than survival. These differences do not fracture community, but they add complexity to decision-making. The environment continues to press gently but persistently. Resources remain finite. Growth reveals limits. These realities lend weight to conversations about sustainability and responsibility, even if those words are not yet used. The land insists on attention, shaping priorities through necessity. By the end of Part 17, awareness has moved beyond individual insight. It has become shared understanding. Not yet action, not yet movement, but alignment. The kind that makes future change possible by making it imaginable. We pause here, in this space of collective recognition. The night around us remains calm, offering rest even as connection deepens. As we drift gently onward into Part 18, these shared conversations will begin to press toward choice, and the quiet alignment of thought will start to shape decisions that carry the potential to alter the course of what has long felt fixed. In Part 18, shared understanding begins to lean toward intention. The conversations that once circled gently now press forward, not urgently, but with purpose. Awareness has gathered long enough to ask something new of those who hold it. What comes next is not yet action, but preparation. A quiet readiness that settles into posture and pace. I imagine myself walking through a familiar town just after sunrise. Shops open as they always have. Animals move through the streets. Bells mark the hour. On the surface, nothing appears different. Yet beneath this routine, something has shifted. People carry themselves with a subtle steadiness, as though they are waiting not for instruction, but for alignment. Discussion grows more deliberate. Meetings last longer. Decisions are weighed more carefully. Language becomes more precise. The questions being asked are no longer simply about what feels wrong, but about what might be done differently. This shift does not bring clarity immediately. It brings responsibility. For colonist communities, the idea of choice begins to take shape. Not a single choice, but many. Choices about cooperation, about refusal, about how much risk is tolerable, and for whom. These considerations vary by region and circumstance, but they share a common thread. The sense that continuation without adjustment is itself a decision. Leadership feels heavier now. Those who speak publicly do so with awareness that words can mobilize or divide. Authority within communities becomes provisional, granted through trust rather than position alone. Listening becomes as important as direction. The pace remains slow, but it is intentional. Indigenous nations navigate this moment with deep caution. They recognize the difference between awareness and accountability. Shared conversation among colonists does not automatically translate into justice or repair. Still, shifts in power create openings. Some leaders engage selectively, pressing for recognition or protection. Others hold distance, shaped by generations of unmet promise. Survival remains grounded in discernment. Enslaved people and their descendants experience this phase through a lens sharpened by exclusion. The movement of thought around them is visible, but often inaccessible. Yet even here, preparation takes form. Networks of care strengthen. Cultural knowledge is preserved with urgency. Quiet strategies endure, holding space for possibility without dependence on external change. Economic life responds to this readiness in subtle ways. Cooperative efforts expand. Mutual support becomes more organized. People test alternatives within existing systems, experimenting cautiously. These efforts do not yet disrupt structure, but they reveal imagination at work. The land continues to influence these preparations. Seasonal cycles dictate timing. Distance complicates coordination. Geography shapes what is possible and when. Rivers, roads, and forests serve as both connectors and constraints, guiding the flow of information and movement. Emotionally, this period carries a sense of poised stillness. Not tension, but attention. People feel the weight of potential. Fear exists, but it is tempered by familiarity with endurance. Hope is present, but measured. There is a shared understanding that whatever comes next will require patience as much as resolve. As I move through this part of the story, I feel history drawing breath. The way one does before speaking carefully. Not because silence is required, but because words matter more now. Choices will echo longer than intentions. Authority beyond the community senses this shift as well. Responses range from accommodation to resistance. Some structures bend slightly, testing whether flexibility can preserve control. Others stiffen, mistaking readiness for threat. These reactions influence how preparation continues, shaping confidence or caution. Within families and close circles, conversations deepen. Values are examined. Priorities clarified. People speak about what they are willing to risk and what they must protect. These discussions are intimate and consequential. They shape not only collective outcomes, but personal ones. The environment offers quiet reminders of consequence. A poor harvest. A difficult winter. A changing river. These moments underscore the importance of foresight and care. The land reinforces the need for preparation grounded in reality rather than ideal. By the end of Part 18, readiness has replaced restlessness. The colonial world is not yet in motion again, but it is no longer static. Awareness has matured into intention. The ground feels firm beneath this preparation, shaped by memory and experience. We pause here, in this careful stillness before decision. The night around us remains calm, offering space to breathe and reflect. As we drift gently onward into Part 19, intention will begin to express itself through commitment, and the quiet readiness of this moment will give way to action shaped not by impulse, but by the long memory of what has already been endured. In Part 19, intention finally finds its footing. What has been quietly prepared now begins to settle into commitment. Not sudden action, not sweeping declaration, but a firm choosing. The kind that reshapes daily behavior before it ever reshapes history books. This is the moment where readiness turns inward and asks, what will I stand within, even if nothing changes quickly? I imagine myself walking through a familiar place at mid-morning. The light is steady. The sounds are ordinary. Yet something has shifted in how people move through the space. There is less hesitation in their steps. Fewer glances toward authority. More attention paid to one another. Commitment does not announce itself loudly. It shows up in posture, in routine, in consistency. Communities begin to act in alignment with what they have been discussing for so long. Agreements are honored more deliberately. Mutual support is no longer improvised but expected. Small structures of cooperation become dependable. Not because they are perfect, but because they are chosen again and again. Trust, once tentative, begins to settle. For colonist communities, commitment expresses itself unevenly. Some choose reform within existing systems. Others choose distance from them. Still others choose resistance in quiet forms. What unites these paths is no longer grievance, but clarity. People know what they are willing to give their time and labor to, and what they will no longer sustain. Leadership stabilizes in new ways. Those who remain visible are not the loudest voices, but the most consistent ones. Authority becomes relational rather than imposed. Decisions are revisited, adjusted, lived with. This kind of leadership does not eliminate conflict, but it contains it more carefully. Indigenous nations continue to navigate commitment under conditions not of their choosing. Yet even here, intention matters. Choice is about engagement, protection of knowledge, and preservation of land-based practice take on renewed importance. Elders emphasize continuity. Youth carry both memory and adaptation. Survival remains active, but it is also deliberate. Enslaved people and their descendants experience commitment as both burden and anchor. The systems constraining them persist, yet commitment to culture, kinship, and selfhood deepens. In spaces where choice is limited, intention focuses inward. On dignity, on care, on persistence. These commitments sustain life in conditions designed to erode it. Economically, commitment reshapes behavior subtly. People invest locally. They rely more on known relationships than distant promises. Exchange becomes more personal. Responsibility becomes shared. These shifts do not overturn inequality, but they begin to redraw how dependence functions within communities. The land reflects this phase through steadiness rather than change. Fields are tended with care rather than urgency. Repairs are made with an eye toward longevity. Paths are maintained because they matter. The environment becomes something to live with thoughtfully, not just to extract from. Emotionally, there is a deepening calm. Not relief, not resolution, but acceptance of complexity. People stop waiting for clarity to arrive from outside. They build meaning where they stand. This does not remove hardship, but it makes it bearable. As I move through this part of the story, I feel the settling of weight. The long arc of colonization has carried fear, conflict, endurance, questioning, and preparation. Now it carries choice. Not a single choice that ends struggle, but many small ones that shape how struggle is lived. Authority beyond the community responds less dramatically now. Some structures adapt quietly. Others fade in relevance. Power shifts not through confrontation alone, but through withdrawal of consent. Through redirection of energy. Through commitment to alternatives that persist. Within families, these commitments are taught through example rather than instruction. Children learn what matters by watching what adults sustain. Memory becomes embodied. Values are transmitted through habit rather than proclamation. The environment continues to insist on patience. Growth takes time. Repair takes time. Healing takes time. The land mirrors the pace of commitment, slow and cumulative. It reminds everyone that lasting change rarely announces itself. By the end of Part 19, the colonial world feels quieter but more grounded. The questions that once unsettled now inform action. The readiness that once waited now moves steadily forward. There is no illusion that struggle has ended. Only the understanding that it is being carried differently. We pause here, in this place of chosen steadiness. The night around us remains calm, offering space to rest within intention. As we drift gently onward into Part 20, we will step into reflection. Not to conclude the story neatly, but to look back across the long arc we have traveled, and to consider what remains when history slows enough to listen to itself. In Part 20, we arrive not at an ending, but at a resting place. A place where the long movement of history slows enough for us to look back across it, not with judgment or urgency, but with understanding. The story of European colonization in North America does not resolve neatly. It settles. It lingers. It continues. And so, in this final part, we allow ourselves to sit quietly with what has been shaped. I imagine myself standing at twilight, where the land opens wide and the horizon softens. The day has done what it can. The light does not disappear all at once. It fades gradually, inviting reflection rather than conclusion. This feels like the right posture for this moment. Not closure, but awareness. Across the centuries we have moved through together, we have watched intentions turn into actions, actions into systems, and systems into inheritance. We have seen how exploration became settlement, settlement became dominance, and dominance became something quieter but no less powerful. Colonization did not end when conflict subsided. It continued through habits, structures, and assumptions passed down through generations. The land itself holds this story most faithfully. Forests cleared and regrown. Rivers redirected and relied upon. Fields worked until they gave what they could. Every change led upon what came before. Nothing entirely erased. Nothing untouched. The land remembers even when people forget. Communities shaped by colonization learned endurance first, then adaptation, then reflection. Some inherited stability built on exclusion. Others inherited loss that required constant resilience. These uneven legacies still move through lives quietly, shaping opportunity, belonging, and memory. Indigenous nations remain central to this story, not as a chapter that closed, but as living continuities. Their endurance did not end with survival alone. It continues through language, land relationship, ceremony, and memory. Despite displacement and harm, identity persists. The continent still carries their presence, even when it is ignored or denied. Enslaved people and their descendants remain another living truth within this history. Their forced labor helped build permanence where freedom was denied. Their culture, resilience, and resistance endure beyond the systems that sought to erase them. Their story does not conclude here either. It continues, shaping the moral and social fabric of everything that followed. For those who inherited power, colonization became background rather than event. Structures felt natural. Boundaries felt fixed. Advantage felt earned. Only with reflection does the weight of history become visible. Not to assign blame to individuals, but to understand how systems outlast intention. What remains most striking, as I sit here in this final part, is how rarely history announces its consequences. Change comes quietly. Through repetition. Through acceptance. Through what is allowed to persist. Colonization did not require constant force once it became structure. It required familiarity. And yet, familiarity is not permanence. Throughout this long arc, we have seen how questioning returns. How awareness grows. How inherited systems eventually face scrutiny from those who live within them. History does not move in straight lines, but it does move. The continent we know today carries all of this. Not as a single narrative, but as many layered ones. Stories of survival alongside stories of loss. Of opportunity alongside dispossession. Of belonging shaped by exclusion. None of these truths cancel the others. They coexist. As background historian, I do not offer resolution. Only presence. The reminder that understanding history does not require restlessness. It can be held gently, looked at slowly, allowed to inform without overwhelming. If there is a quiet lesson here, it is this. What is built slowly must be examined slowly. What is inherited unconsciously must be understood consciously. And what has endured this long will continue to shape what comes next, whether it is named or not. So as we rest here at the close of this 20-part journey, let the story settle rather than conclude. Let it exist as landscape rather than argument, as memory rather than verdict. The night has fully arrived now. The land is quiet. The long arc of history continues beyond our telling, moving at its own patient pace. Thank you for drifting through this story with me. You do not need to hold it tightly. You may let it rest beside you, like a familiar horizon seen at dusk. And as you settle into stillness, remember, history does not ask us to stay awake. It asks only that we listen when we are ready. Rest now. As our time together gently comes to a close, I invite you to remain right where you are, without needing to gather anything up or reach for meaning too quickly. Stories like this one are not meant to be carried all at once. They are meant to be set down softly, like a lantern placed beside the bed, still glowing, but no longer demanding attention. Tonight, we moved slowly across centuries. We followed waves across an ocean, footsteps into forests, voices into settlements, and memories into inheritance. We did not rush to conclusions or tidy endings, because history itself rarely offers those. Instead, we allowed the story of European colonization in North America to unfold as it truly did. Gradually, unevenly, quietly shaping lives long after the first ships arrived. If parts of the journey felt heavy, that is natural. This history carries weight. But weight does not have to disturb rest. It can be acknowledged and then released, like a breath leaving the body. You are not responsible for resolving what you heard tonight, only for witnessing it gently and letting it pass through. As background historian, my role is not to judge or instruct, but to keep watch over memory, to sit beside the past and describe it without urgency, to remind us that understanding does not require alertness. It can happen even as the mind softens and drifts. You may notice now that your thoughts are slowing, that the edges of the story are fading into atmosphere rather than detail. That is exactly as it should be. History, when offered for rest, becomes less about facts and more about feeling. The sense of time moving, of land enduring, of people adapting, questioning, persisting. Outside this moment, the world continues as it always does. But here, in this quiet space, there is nothing left to do. No more listening required. No more remembering. The story can remain unfinished in your mind, because history itself is unfinished. If sleep comes, welcome it without effort. If wakefulness lingers, let it be gentle. You may replay a single image. A shoreline at dusk. A lantern in a window. A wide landscape settling into night. Or you may let everything dissolve into darkness, where words no longer matter. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for trusting me to guide you slowly through a long and complicated past, and for allowing yourself to rest within it. I will remain here, keeping watch over the quiet spaces of history whenever you wish to return. For now, let the night hold you. Rest easily. Background historian out.